Mr. Speaker, we see how it is essential into the situation that we have nowadays that we actually stop the terrorist threats that we have into our society. We see how actually ISIS has progressed the last few months. We see how actually it's a dire situation where a military, the Iraqi military that has completely outnumbered ISIS. After all, they have actually ran away and were not basically able to fight, or the 30,000 military was not able to fight a 1,000 military that ISIS had. Moreover, we see how actually they do operate in Syria as well, and we believe that actually the US as a country that has most of the resources actually should target the terrorists, and they should actually with drones target the terrorists in order to prevent them to further progress into these countries. So what we basically see is that the USA and the coalition, the USA and the whole coalition that are actually making the drones into Iraq and Syria nowadays, we see that basically they have stated that at no point they're ready to actually go with ground troops into there. So basically when we see that actually the countries are not ready to sacrifice their own resources, I'm going to talk about that more into the development of the arguments, but when we see that the countries are basically not ready to go there with ground troops, the only actually mechanism that we have here in order to help prevent the further development of ISIS in that region is basically going that with drones, and this is why we actually support that. Now, yes?
Are you aware of the fact that US airstrikes were not the most effective in fighting ISIS, but rather Kurdish fighters on the ground?
Yeah, no, so basically I'm going to talk about that more, but the Kurdish fighters wouldn't actually be that successful without the help of the drones that America has. So basically having the drones is a big asset into the fight against ISIS. I'm going to talk about it more. So what happens? So what happens basically? The USA says we will either go with drones or we will not actually make ground troops. In this case, we actually believe that it is very beneficial to have the drones into the ISIS. So what happens? What happens basically there, and what are the benefits of the drones themselves, and why America should actually have the drones over there? Now, firstly, we have seen, so for example, not just the US have actually targeted terrorists into Iraq and into Syria as well. Now, no, thank you. The best example and the latest example is actually what happens in Kobani. We have seen that the Kurdish fighters actually could not succeed to prevent them to take over Kobani, and they still actually have succeeded the prevention of taking over Kobani just because the US came and targeted. So what happens is that basically the Kurdish fighters have resisted over there, but that wouldn't have been as successful as it is now, even though we see that actually the fight in Kobani is not over. But the ISIS would have taken over 2 months ago this city if it wasn't for the US drones and if it wasn't for the strike that actually targeted the terrorist groups over there. So what we basically see, according to this example, and also in Iraq, is that basically drones stop the further development of the terrorist group itself. Now, we do not say that the drones themselves will completely diminish the group, and it will not exist anymore, or that it will be not a threat there anymore. But what we say is basically that we are actually stopping the development of the terrorist group itself, because when you have drones that come out, no, thank you. Because when you have drones that actually are targeting these places, that way, basically, first of all, you do not have your own victims, but moreover, you basically, since we know, since ISIS operates, does not operate underground, such as, for example, Al-Qaeda, what we see is that basically the US knows where actually these targets are and knows where to target, so we basically prevent having a lot of civilian deaths. Now what happens basically is that, first of all, for example, if we actually have, we do realize that we will have civilian deaths, but that will also happen, for example, if we have ground troops as well. Now, but basically what happens is that when you have ground troops, you have civilians on both sides. You have firstly the ones that you target, you have the civilians, but on the other side you have victims also on your own side. Now this is something that the countries want to prevent, but when you actually have drones, you prevent the civilian deaths on your own side, but on the other hand, you target directly the terrorist groups itself. Now what we see here is beneficial is that that yes, when we actually do not have the drone, if we do not have the drones, we can see that basically the Kurdish fighters are not able to do this themselves, and anyways we'll have civilians that will be killed, raped, violated, and etc. from the side of the ISIS. So this is something that we cannot prevent, but we actually can have less civilian deaths, ladies and gentlemen. So what we basically see why is actually also in the U.S. interest and why we should support the U.S. having drones. Now, firstly, because we need safe area in the Middle East, ladies and gentlemen, and this is something we do not have actually if ISIS operates. So what happens is that basically, first of all, there has been videos of ISIS terrorists who basically claim that they are going to come and take over the Western America, ladies and gentlemen, or that they're actually going to fight into the Western, into the America. So what happens is basically that first of all, America is supposed to prevent that, and they're actually trying to prevent that and going to prevent that better when they actually use drones, because at least they stop the further development. Now, but moreover, we actually believe that that the US, it is better to have drones, firstly because this is also a requirement, and the Iraq, for example, are asking themselves to basically come for the US and target with drones and rescue them. Moreover, actually even Syria and Assad say that they are actually ready to have the USA come with drones if they actually make contracts, for example, with the USA, that they are not going to target the government itself. So what we basically see is that actually by targeting the terrorists over there, we actually are gaining a ground for on the spot themselves and on the ground troops to better fight against ISIS. But moreover, if it comes to a situation where we actually have in the future some sort of safe area, that way we can actually, the USA can pursue the connections and can pursue have connections with their allies. So because we have shown you how dire the situation is, how the Kurdish fighters cannot fight themselves, but the countries themselves, the West countries, are not ready to actually invest with ground troops. This is why we see that the drones are stopping the further development, and it's in the interest of the US. Therefore, we believe that actually they should go with drones. For all these reasons, we are proud to go.
Thank the Prime Minister for their fine speech. Now, we'd like to invite the leader of the opposition. Here.
Okay, may I? Newsflash for the OG. ISIS is a product of a drone policy. As I will explain in one of my constructive points, drone policy and making civilians fear of the US and the US war policies made ISIS stronger and make ISIS possible. The thing that prevented ISIS weren't recent drone strikes, but were females fighting against ISIS, because ISIS, fear of them, were dying from a girl, and therefore when Kurds started using that strategy, that is why ISIS couldn't fight Kobane anymore. But furthermore, a rebuttal. They offer us a false dichotomy that either drones, either nothing, either we will have total takeover of the ISIS. But furthermore, we say to you that there are alternatives of fighting terrorism. You can put your boots on the ground, and yes, we believe that people, when see that it is necessary and the terrorists are a real threat, they will prop that policy. But second analogy is to use real planes with actual pilots. And the difference between that and drones, it is you have a pilot there who will not just randomly shoot everything he sees. He will have some certain moral obligation towards civilians. But furthermore, how do we target drones? We are not just targeted 100% sure, it is far less percentage that we will actually target terrorists. We usually target, and we are eager to do. We do not have our men on the plane to target the civilians, and usually civilians are casualties in a drone strikes. Therefore, that is the difference between men on the plane. We will send the men on the plane when we are 100% sure that we have a legitimate target to do so. So we show to you that there are alternatives to fighting drones. Secondly, is the logic later on. Secondly, there is a logic that, simple logic, we bomb them, they have less logistics, therefore they're less powerful. Firstly, they never proved to us that why we will actually destroy their logistics as such? Because as I put to you, firstly, it is not just a question of ISIS. Drones are also used in the other part of the world with Taliban who are hiding, and therefore we are shooting weddings, we are shooting civilian areas, such, and therefore we do not destroy, we do not effectively do the harm to them. But secondly, even if ISIS is in a plain sight, we believe that A, they hide their weapons, and secondly, when their troops are on a plain sight, they are usually in the cities that they conquered, and those cities have civilians as such, and therefore we have more illegitimate targets as such. Okay, now the outcomes of this policy is more civilians that live in fear, more civilians that are illegitimately targeted, and civilians are different that war, that there are different casualties than boots on the ground. But when you have boots on the ground, and that will leading to the more extremism, and that goes against our criteria, because criteria of less extremism is the reason why we choose war policy. Go.
So just to make things clear, what methods of fighting against terrorism do you support?
What methods? Okay, the method that we should do, that it is that brings less of these negative side effects, I will explain on the civilians on the ground, because we need, firstly, there are two main purposes of intervention. A, to protect civilians on the ground, and B, to prevent strengthening of the extremism in order not to get to the US or not to get to Europe. Now, we will show to you why drones are the ones who have the most negative influence on the civilians. A, as I explained in my rebuttal, there are more casualties, more random casualties, collateral targets with drones, because we do not have certain info that we can rely on, and therefore we shoot randomly on the civilians. Secondly, civilians cannot evacuate themselves as in war. They know when the war is, they know where is the war field, and therefore they can evacuate, they can explain. And usually they are not the ones who participate in war. In war, the ones who died are soldiers and are the combatants. And secondly, when you have such high amount of casualties, you have civilians who turn your back against you in two ways. A, youth who lives in a constant fear because of the drones. They cannot be aware of, like the casual planes, for example. But drone come out of the blue and causes the fear amongst them. Therefore, you have more youth, go more extreme, and therefore you have ISIS. Therefore, you have more groups who gain support, who gain more support, and therefore more strength and more they can create more cells and become a bigger threat on the ground, and therefore gather more capital to fight you, on the West. But secondly, you not just gain more young people join the troops, but you have less people on the ground who are willing to fight against those troops, because now they do not see those troops as a primary threat to their everyday life. Now they see the US as a primary threat to their everyday life, and therefore they're more willingly, without any threat and without any mean of terrorists convincing them to hide them. They want to help now the terrorist groups just by not fighting them, or by providing them shelters as such. And you need those civilians. You need those civilians, and you need support of those civilians long-termly to take over the terrorists, on that ground. And final point is principle one. Why do we have a due process of law and not extrajudicial killing? Because the reason, we want the truth. We want the info that we can check. We want to see whether that person is guilty or not, in order to have a reconciliation on that region, in order to have people believe in the justice, and people believe that we are doing the right thing. So, we believe too that there is higher possibility of chance that a terrorist or a combatant that is killed in a combat, or that is killed on a war, is the one who, because he willingly joined the troop, is the one who is the guilty one, and who and died on his own by his fault, and not the one who is randomly targeted with uncertain info. You leave the story unfinished, and therefore you do not have the benefits of the due process of law. You do not have people who will say, but you just have a prolonged fighting in a region that will outcome negatively. Such and then U.S. will not have a legitimacy to spread its policy on the rest of the Middle East countries. It will lose their soft power. But now, that is the reason why Pakistan reconsiders whether or whether not they will provide their air harbors to the U.S. ships, because they feel now threatened of the U.S. and their U.S. is a threat towards their civilians. Such even numbers speak for itself. And it will be brought in a second speech, so therefore we are proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader for their remarks. And now I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister, and once again to remind the teams to keep their conversation as quiet as possible, not to disrupt the speaker. Hear, hear.
May I? Mr. Speaker, now the proposition here acknowledges that there are victims coming from drones, but we do believe that if we stop ISIS, if we do not stop ISIS, the victims that will come out of the terroristic movement will be a lot bigger. Secondly, we believe that we need to stop ISIS through drone attacks because the USA and the coalition has already arranged and agreed that they will not enter with ground troops. But even if this wasn't the fact, even if the opposition believes that somehow, in some way, in some universe, they will actually enter with ground troops, we're going to prove you that that's a bad idea as well. Bad idea for the allies and bad idea for the region. So let's go to the rebuttals first. They say ISIS is a product of drone policy. Now, first of all, this is totally untrue. ISIS is a product of military presence within the Islamic countries where people feel oppressed when there is a military presence in that country. We influence curfews when we're there. We set ourselves above their laws. We set ourselves as the peacekeeper and provide them with the protection that not necessarily the citizens acknowledge that kind of protection, and the citizens accept the militaries that are there. And we believe that the oppression that comes from military, we have seen a lot of videos where military presence are actually harming the citizens there, or laughing at the citizens there, or beating them up. This sort of army presence and troop presence actually leads to creation of terroristic groups. The second thing, they mention is that there are alternatives, and they say, well, we can put a ground troop there. Now we believe that first this is not a plausible thing to do. This is not a plausible thing because already the whole coalition and the USA-led coalition said that they will simply not want to sacrifice their own men and entering ground troops. And secondly, we believe that the military presence is a lot bigger. Lastly, in this argument, they talk about the existence of pilots and how somehow they have this assumption that we randomly target places. Now, this is a huge misconception. We have surveillance, we have the CIA, we have a lot of bodies who actually basically work and find out information where the terrorists are found, when the terrorists are located, and then the drones come in and attack the specific targets, which are given specific information where should they blow up the place or what sort of people should they blow up. They mentioned something about weddings and terrorists. Now this is a huge difference between what terrorism was a few years ago and what terrorism nowadays is. Now we see who are the terrorists. We know ISIS acknowledges themselves as a terrorist. Now the necessity for us, it is much easier to fight this kind of terrorists and to basically attack them from the sky with drones because we simply know their presence. But even if we're talking about still Al-Qaeda and bombing weddings, we still have a situation where when we have logistics, when we have information on what sort of people we have to target, we do not simply randomly do so. The next thing they talked about how drones create casualties and how this is it's much better to enter ground troops. Now, firstly, yes, we do acknowledge that there are casualties, but we do believe in the fact that the casualties are also created with ground troops because military also fire at civilians. First thing. Second thing, casualties are also created by pilots. The pilots also gain the information that is being given from their commander, and they always listen to the information. They do not have the moral code or whether they should shoot or not shoot. In fact, the USA doesn't have the law that says that if you have some sort of moral problem with this, you shouldn't shoot at people. They basically said that if your commander tells you to shoot, you basically have to shoot the place because there is information that you have to shoot there. And lastly, we believe that the number of the civilians that are present there because of the drones is a lot smaller than the number of the civilians that are created from the ISIS who are basically killing people, torturing people, or raping women just because they don't want to change their religion. And lastly, they talked about how this is a bad thing for the Middle East. Now, for example, we see Iraq coming out and saying that if the USA brings ground troops within Iraq, because of the fact they specifically said that they do not want the presence of ground troops from Iraq, from USA coming in Iraq, because they believe and fear that the US troops are going to coalition with the Shiite government. And basically we see a situation where the Islamic world is asking for a drone attack and is welcoming the drone attacks and rather refusing ground troops because they believe that this is not in their benefits because of what happened when the USA was present there, because because that's how terrorist organizations were at rise. Because people believe that the military presence is basically harming them. They felt oppressed. They feel that if you create a curfew and tell me when I can go out and when I cannot go out, it's a lot more oppressive and harming to the citizens, and they feel a lot more threatened when there is a ground troop there. Now, yes, people. Yes, thank you.
But it is the same mechanism with drones. Just it is much more emphasized because with drones you cannot go out any time because you don't know when the danger will come up and you feel like you're living in a constant fear.
Thank you, madam. But the difference here is that if we do not provide the drones, if the USA doesn't provide the drones, and this is my last argument, I'm going to lastly talk about this, if the US is not allowed to enter with drones, and the coalition as well is not allowed to enter with the drones, then we will not have any sort of military presence outside the Kurdish army. Now we believe that this presence, military presence coming out from the air, from the coalition and the USA is very essential to stop the fighting, to stop the ISIS. Now we're not saying that it is the only solution, but we're saying that without that, basically, we wouldn't be able to stop the progress in Kobani coming out from the ISIS. That without them, without this essential necessity, we will not be able to stop the ISIS. Now, yes, even there may be victims there, but what we're saying that stopping the ISIS is a lot more important. And lastly, and this was an argument that wasn't at all tackled from the opposition, we believe that this is within the interest of the USA to basically do this thing. Now, we saw a lot of, firstly, for the interest of their private security at home, and lastly, to the security of their allies. Now, firstly, we saw a lot of videos coming up from ISIS saying that we're coming, America, we're coming for you. Now, we say that they have a responsibility towards their citizens to stop the threat of terrorism coming to their homes and knocking on their door. Now, we believe that this is why stopping the terrorists in any way they can without sacrificing their own troops is within the U.S. interest. And secondly, is within U.S. interest. Guys are basically asking for it, and this is the only way that they can respond without influencing the problems that come in Iraq. So because we believe that we acknowledge victims, because we believe that this is the only way that we can stop ISIS, because USA is unwilling to enter by ground troops, we believe that you should vote to set government. Thank you.
Good evening, Prime Minister, and I'll propose the debate on the top half. We invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have 4 points of substantive, but for that, a little point of clarification. Opening government talks about ISIS, but they never provide why drones are essential for killing the ISIS. They say that you also have to use the other things. You also have to use to train Peshmerga forces in Kurdistan. You also can, an alternative, send the ground troops, or to send just planes when you can control. There was no responses when Savita asked, why not send planes to that? So, basically, we're going to have a shit with ISIS anyway. They never show us any comparative why drones made a significant difference. But why they they didn't do is, they never talked about Yemen, they never talked about Pakistan, about the countries where we are using drugs for 10 years, about countries that actually this debate should be about, because those, you don't have a constant war all the time. You have just American forces sending drones to kill civilians and the terrorist boat. We're going to talk more about that because this is what's about the debate about. Only one point of rebuttal. They say we never tackled that there's not in their interest. We believe that if we have more extremism, as Elisaveta explained, it's pretty much why it's not in the interest of the United States to do so. Okay, 4 points of substantive. Firstly, the drones. We believe that drones have two things. First, controllable. That means that you don't sit in the drone and see we're going to bomb as you're using the plane, but you're sitting somewhere in America and don't control. What has the problem? Firstly, because you can't really see what you're using doing that. Secondly, because actually because they're not really precise that much. Lots of testimonies of American soldiers saying that they're not really precise. It's like playing a game with that helicopter. Yes, you can be precise to some extent, but also it can also. Secondly, because they use the mass gathering. They don't just use, whether they're terrorists. They also use, when you see lots of people gathering, for example, in the desert, if they presume that they are shoot them. That happened in Yemen. They destroyed the whole wedding because they believed that they were terrorists. We believe that it's a crime against humanity that is not really good to have. Secondly, about civilians. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, living in Yemen and your fear of blue sky. Why? Because drones don't go when it's raining. Because when it's blue skies, drones are flying, you don't see them, you hear a little sound, and you don't know where they're going to shoot. It's much different than the war. Why? No, thank you. Firstly, when you have a war, and you have troops in the town, when you have constant wars, and Yemen and Pakistan are not that kind of territories, as we explained, then you can move away, you can try refugee. Those wars even last for a shorter time. But here we have that whole areas of Yemen and Pakistan are threatened. They live in a constant fear. 92% of Yemenis, according to the study, have PTSD, depression, or paranoia because they live in the constant fear that drones are going to shoot them. There's much difference when the troops on the ground, because you see them, you don't have constant fear. You should see the tanks, you can move away, you can run to other village, you can actually give up, rise up your arms and see and say that you give up. So basically, that's why we believe that comparatively, much more civilians feel fear, much more civilians have really huge problems. Also, no thank you. Also, I say they're going to be less civilians killing. Only in 2009 in Pakistan, 900 civilians was killed due to drones. It's really huge because in Pakistan there was no any grounds in the troop. If you had the other methods of dealing that, we have much less victims. And even if we had more victims, for example, more American soldiers dying, we believe it's fine because you opt in to be a soldier. Then you know the risk of being killed. But civilians, you don't opt in to live in Yemen and be shot by the drone. Also, when that happens, we believe that lots of youth, when they see someone from their family killed, when they see someone from the nation being killed, no thank you. That's much more give legitimacy to Al-Qaeda to gather them, to show them, look, that's what they are doing. If you have troops on the ground, you can only say that only in specific regions you can gather people. But here you have vast region that's much higher and that. Also, comparatively, drones are seen as you are targeting someone. So when a wedding is shot by the drone, people are seeing it as targeting the wedding. If the wedding were presumably killed by a tank that was just on the ground, people will see this was a mistake. We believe that gives the more people actually thinking that America has something against the civilians. That's why more people join Al-Qaeda. That's why we have a larger number, no thank you later, of AKAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, people joining those forces. We believe it's really, really problematic. No thank you later. Thirdly, there are also other alternatives for those things that we never choose, like cooperation. Like for example, in the UAE, they opened the Taliban opened the office when they wanted to cooperate with the Pakistani government. What happened next? The Americans sent a drone and killed one of their leader. What happened then? They closed the office. They didn't want to cooperate even more. We didn't never try to cooperate. We didn't have all other methods. That's completely disregarded for the government's bench. What we believe that we never tried and we don't have legitimacy to have extrajudicial killings if we didn't show that there are all other methods that were proven. Finally, fine point before that, yes.
One airstrike in order to minimize the amount of military casualties. What the US and Western troops try to do is fly from great heights, where you don't have precision bombing. And the best examples of this is the bombing of Belgrade, where there were more civilian casualties and as a result more hate.
Yeah, but also in the Belgrade there were really little civilian casualties. Most of all the casualties that was killed were also said. They, for example, yes, they're going to shoot the building of the national television, but the thing that lots of civilians died there is because the director of the national television said them, stay there, you have to stay there, you cannot move. You need to point us to the many examples of those things that were not deliberately killed by the NATO. Finally, logistics. So even if you heard some of the logistics of those terrorists, why this is not substantial gain for the drones? 3 reasons. Firstly, let's for example assume that yes, we concede that there are some leaders of the Taliban or the terrorists who were killed in the drones. But what I want to say on that is that lots of those forces are actually guerrilla forces. They don't have that strong hierarchy. So that's why when you kill the leader, it's not to be a big damage. So, secondly, even some leaders, like for example Al-Shabaab, are not even known. So basically, that's not like a huge hierarchical structure. You have lots of fractions of those terror groups. If you kill just one leader, you don't gain that much. Secondly, they're easily replaceable because usually only your son, something like that, is going to replace you. So that's why you don't gain that much in the logistics. Thirdly, even if you damage some things like, for example, communication, like people in the Mali, after being threatened by the drones, stopped the terrorists from the Mali stopped using in the internet. Well, what's more harmful? Because they started using more civilians. They forced more civilians to join them and to beat them logistics because they were afraid that America is going to do that. That's why we believe it's really problematic. What we brought you from the opening opposition and why we win. Firstly, the civilians are more harmed on that criteria that we win. Secondly, that due to that there will be more terrorists, therefore worse for America. And thirdly, that the gains we have are minimal and marginal. So for all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you, David, for your speech, and now we move on to the second half of the debate being by the member of government. Here.
Two things you should note from the very start. Sudan, Yemen, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Mali, and a lot of other Maghreb countries are examples of countries with huge terrorist presence. It is simply implausible to claim that the United States can have a significant land troops in those countries. So you have to have some kind of fighting against terrorism in those countries as well. So the second thing to note is that since 2008 and the implementation of the strategic operational initiative by David Petraeus, you had a significant reduction in civilian casualties from drone strikes. This happened after the Farah City massacre, where the U.S. troops realized that huge civilian casualties are harming the fight against terrorism. From that moment onward, while you had a drastic increase in drone strikes during the Obama administration, the amount of civilian casualties per drone strike has reduced significantly. This was done with the precise goals of winning the hearts and minds of those civilians. It is in the U.S. strategic interest to have at least some level of support from those countries. Several points in my speech. Why the destruction of leadership is so important, why drones are effective, and how this wins on the comparative, and we'll also deal with a lot of other issues. Shortly, to put the ISIS question to rest, we don't think that the rise of ISIS is due to US drone strikes. It could be to a number of other things, like the strengthening of Al-Qaeda in the late 2000s, like the sectarian politics of Nouri al-Maliki, like the best proven by the troop surge in 2007, which led to a reduction in terrorist attacks in Iraq when you had an increase in US troops there. Secondly, when it comes to relation with populations in those countries, as I already pointed out, it is hard to strong troop presences in all of those countries. But two, it's not necessarily a comparative, because a lot of strikes before drones were mostly by aircraft, which created the very same amount of casualties. The last point we want to make there is that strike by aircrafts by military aircraft don't have a bigger amount of casualties in comparison with drones. It's always people who fly and who are far away from the conflict. So when you're at 20,000 feet above, there's not a significant difference in being in the US. Plus, those people are subject to the same kinds of accountability as people who fly military aircraft. Also, when it comes to things like Pakistan, note that the US has implicit support of the Pakistani government to fight the Tehrik-i Taliban in Pakistan, because that's an issue that the Pakistani government cannot solve. But it would be incredibly unlikely to accept permanent US presence on the ground. The assassination of Osama bin Laden and the backlash of the Pakistani government is good proof of that. However, the Pakistani government is unable to fight terrorists, for instance, in North Waziristan, so it implicitly accepts US support in doing that. No, thank you. When it comes to Yemen and the huge amount of PTSD there, we would simply argue that it's probably due to having a failed state and a continuous civil war rather than thanks to US drone strikes. So now when it comes to the disruption of leadership, we think there are 4 things, thank you, which leaders can bring to these organizations. They can bring resources, knowledge, experience, as well as contacts with other terrorist groups. Note that Al-Qaeda, since 2001, has been largely fragmentalized, compartmentalized, and franchised precisely because of huge attacks on leadership. Note that after the assassination of Hakimullah Masood in Pakistan, you had a short-term increase in violence by the Taliban, but after that you had a reduction in attacks in big urban areas like Lahore, and Taliban attacks were mostly reduced to urban areas. The similar things happened after the death of Shamil Basayev in Chechnya. So what we tell you is that these leaders, by assassination of leaders, you're creating problems in the organization of some groups. Even in some other groups, Al-Qaeda also being a good example, you have inside power struggles, which makes those organizations less effective and less capable of making new attacks in the future. So what we tell you is that these attacks are incredibly effective. So why are drones a particularly good way of doing that? One, they have longer flight hours because simply they have less weight, so they can be active for 20 or 24 hours. Notice, for instance, that in 2003, an unarmed drone noticed a convoy that was probably carrying Osama bin Laden. By the time US aircraft could be scrambled to do that, the convoy was already away. You lose on time, which you have when you have drones. You don't have to have a pilot in them. People can change shift. That is a unique advantage which drones have. No, thank you. 2, it's often very hard to put troops on this ground. Note that drones mostly operate in large mountainous areas. It's incredibly unlikely to have land troops in all of those areas. It's incredibly unlikely to have land troops in the whole of Yemen. However, it is very effective to be overseen by drones because it is largely an area without huge vegetation, which means you have good oversight of it. Yeah, go.
Yeah, sir, but those leaders usually, when they are targeted, they're just hiding away, so they don't have those benefits to their organization. So if you want to target them in the first place, they usually don't have those benefits to organization because they're hiding and they know that they don't have.
Well, okay, sometimes we do find them, but the comparative is sometimes we will miss them and not kill them. But at least in some instances we do that. On your side of the house, we get no killing of those leaders whatsoever. So what we tell you is that drones can be uniquely efficient precisely because of long flight hours. And now we want to look at the alternatives. So what can we do? We can keep those people, no thank you, and don't solve a problem. Keeping terrorists is bad because of reasons I already explained, obviously because they can organize new terrorist attacks and insurgencies and build up their resources. 2, troops on ground can create an even worse situation. Why? Note that those troops can also have problems with the civilian population, so building links is good. But what happens far more often is an alienation of those populations. So you have things like black water contractors in Iraq firing on civilians, both because of hatred and fear of them. Lastly, when it comes to manned airstrikes, one, we tell you that a loss of pilots who commit manned airstrike can lead to a loss of capital for interventions in the future. Note how the US withdrew from Somalia after Black Hawk Down. We tell you that that is incredibly harmful because it reduces the operational capabilities which you have. Also, the similar things happen after the American population was fed up with Iraq. Secondly, we tell you that often, as I already mentioned, they don't have an adequate amount of time. But 3, they're much more likely to engage in irrational acts of violence when their own life is on the line. So when a pilot sits in a drone pilot sits in the US, he knows his life is not on the line. That means he's more likely on a comparative to be rational than, say, a chopper pilot who could possibly be killed. Lastly, when it comes to accountability shortly. One, they already, even if there's no broader accountability, there's still operational and strategical accountability, i.e. we don't want to additionally alienate population. Two, when it comes to trials, yes, everyone deserves a fair trial, but if we can't find those people, and if we can't capture them, we think it's unfair to lead to huge amount of civilian deaths just because those individuals necessarily deserve a right to a fair trial. We think that we should care far more about civilians who are harmed by precisely those terrorist organizations in Pakistan, in Yemen, and in other places. Please propose.
Take a member of the government for speech, and now I would like to invite the member of the opposition. Here.
May I? Yes, Mr. Speaker, terrorism has changed. Yes, Mr. Speaker, there is a huge and widespread terrorist presence, and Mr. Speaker, it is because of this presence and because of civilian casualties that do not in any way help us to remove this presence that drone strikes are ineffective. And this is what I'm going to explain to you through my speech, through my first point of extension, followed by two more points of extension, where I'm going to explain to you why the way that the USA is acting by implementing drones is only a way of pacifying the population, is contradictory to the principles of the war on terror, and is only going to lose to the US losing popular support and losing political capital. But before that, I want to open with a few points of rebuttal on what was said by the other side of the table. They tell us that the United States of America cannot have a significant ground presence because terrorism is widespread, because it's really rooted in the population, because terrorists are everywhere. We cannot designate or specify where they are located, and there's not a pole in the middle of the city where all terrorists are going to gather. Well, exactly for that reason, exactly for the reason that drones target a single place, a single target, because they cannot target a huge widespread population, and they have more civilian casualties than they actually have terrorist casualties. This is the reason they're ineffective. Exactly because the reason the terrorists are widespread and we cannot know where their positions actually are, and that we target mostly civilian targets, that's the reason they're ineffective. And the reason you were speaking about why terrorist groups are created. You said that there are various reasons why terrorist groups are created, but they all come down to one thing in the end: because of civilian casualties. Because a foreign power, a major power, has decided to come in, has decided to react in a way that's going to take the lives of civilians, the lives of citizens of a country, and is not going to improve the situation in fighting terrorists. This is the reason why terrorist groups are created. When there is a threat within a country, that's why you have rival terrorist groups, for example. And this is the reason why extremism is created in the first place, as they have already explained. Now, the fact that the Pakistani government has support for the United States to fight terrorism does not mean that drones are necessarily the best way to fight terrorism. It means only and only that we should fight terrorism, but it does not mean that we should fight terrorism through methods that cause civilian casualties. And secondly, how are drones connected in any way to the fact that it is hard to disable the leadership of a terrorist organization? Exactly because drones cannot eliminate, cannot disable the leadership of a terrorist organization, we believe they're ineffective. And this is what leads to the conclusion of my rebuttal. Yes, it's hard to have a ground presence in mountainous countries. It's hard to have a ground presence that's going to eliminate all terrorists, and sometimes it's not perhaps worth sacrificing our own troops. But what we do today in modern generation, fourth generation warfare, what we do, we support the indigenous groups on the ground. We will support the Kurds in Kobani. We will support the Syrian rebels who are going to fight terrorists. This is what we're going to do. Because we're a major power, because we have finances, because we have resources, we are going to support the indigenous troops on the ground who are already present there and who are going to be able to fight the terrorists. We're going to give them financial support. We're going to arm them. This is what we're going to do because we know that their goals are the same as ours. We can, if we want to, we can decide which groups we're going to support, which groups are the most capable of fighting terrorists, and we can support them. And this is exactly what I'm going to talk about in my first point of extension. And this fourth generation warfare. Exactly today, military experts are defining terrorism as being part of a fourth generation warfare. Exactly as you have said, it's not the same as it was before. We cannot define clear borders where terrorists are unarmed. We cannot define because they're rooted within the population, because they have huge civilian support, because they're hiding everywhere. We cannot exactly discern where they are hiding, and exactly because of that, we believe that civilian targets are going to be the biggest casualties, and you cannot fight terrorists in this way because you're not adapted to modern warfare. Perhaps this was effective when you know you have to bomb a city, you know where your target is, you know what you have to do to disable your enemy. But when you do not know that, when you're not in a situation to know that, when using a method that's targeting only a specific point that's having a lot of civilian casualties is ineffective. I'll take opening.
You talk about financial support, for example, supporting weapons. When that backfired, when the US left their weapons to the Iraqi government and the ISIS have taken over them, so we see how your way of fighting has backfired on you.
On the other hand, you have Kurdish fighters in Kobani who have managed to repel ISIS by themselves. Now imagine how much more effective they would have been if the US had offered much more significant support than it already had offered. But the second thing that I want to talk to you about is the following. I want to talk to you about that there's exactly a reason, and there's a message that we're sending by using these methods that are ineffective in eliminating targets. Of course, the US has special ops, the US has covert ops, these types of ops that are, of course, most in eliminating designated targets in fourth-generation warfare. But what drones do, they pacify the populace. Sometimes it backfires. Sometimes because of that, the terrorist groups are created, because people want to fight against this. But the reason why the US uses drones, they use drones to pacify the populace, to keep them in fear, so that one day, when the United States decides, as they most often decide, that they want to come in, that they want to depose a regime, and that they want to take their natural resources, the people are not going to fight against them. Sure, it backfires, and we believe it should backfire, but that's the reason they do it. They do it to keep the populace in fear. They do it because, and it's completely immoral. They have used Pakistan and Yemen in generally as lab rats. They have not achieved great successes, but what they have done, they have taken civilian casualties. They have done that to promote their hidden agenda. And we believe that this is something that we should not support. The idea that the United States is able to take civilian targets at their own decision without any legitimacy, without any success, we believe it's wrong. And what this leads, this is my third point of extension. This is contrary to the principles of the war on terror. Why? Because the idea of terrorism is you're going to target civilians, you're going to keep people in fear, so you're going to achieve your goals. Now, if the USA does the very same thing, if they do exactly what the terrorists are doing, if they're trying to keep people in fear, to pacify the population, what they are doing, taking more civilian casualties, they're doing the same thing as the terrorists are. What does that mean? That at one time they're going to lose political capital and they're going to lose popular support, because already today there's criticism of the way the USA is handling the situation with terrorists. Why? Because they're handling it in a pretty bad way. They're handling it in a way that's contrary to their own principles. What the USA should do, it should support indigenous population fighting against the terrorists, and it should offer significant support in that way, but not fight in a way that's unadapted to modern warfare, that's likely to create more terrorism, that is part of a hidden imperialist agenda, and that in the end is going to make them lose their support that they have, their support that's already diminishing. For all these reasons, we're proud to oppose the motion. Thank you very much.
In Pakistan, drone strikes took down the heads of the Haqqani network. It killed the Masood brothers. One of the consequences of these drone attacks was the degradation of the capacity of these terrorist groups to mount attacks. How do we know this? Before the removal of Masood brothers, you had the TTP, that's the Pakistani Taliban, able to kill Benazir Bhutto, able to bomb the Marriott in Islamabad. Since then, you've had a movement which has far less geographic reach, which is now limited to attacks in parts of the northwest frontier provinces and Baluchistan. In the end, we are willing to admit that in some circumstances you have minimal civilian casualties. We are thinking that is acceptable collateral damage. Maybe you will still end up with hate, but hate which doesn't lead to violence because of the degradation of capacities is a win for our side. 3 points of one, I want to talk about high-value targets, why they attacked by drone strikes, why that's important. Secondly, I want to look at why you need to use drones and why the alternatives are worse. Finally, I want to look at collateral damage and why it isn't as serious as the previous speaker and the government claims. First, 1 point in rebuttal. They think it is instead good that you help rebel movements on the ground. In some cases, like in the case of the Peshmergas in Kurdistan, that is a possibility. In many cases, it isn't. Why isn't it possible? Because you often don't have accountability or control of those rebel movements. A great example of the Mujahideen in the 1980s, supported by the United States, then they ultimately break away, and then you end up with a Taliban as a result. You see this with the Syrian rebels, people we were hoping to fund, but ultimately ended up also being supporters of jihadists. So we don't think that you end up with that kind of control at all. It's also they have their own interest. Look, for instance, at General Dostrom, an Uzbek leader in northern Afghanistan, funded by the United States in the early parts of the 2000s. What does he do with his weapons? He kills rivals and uses mass casualties. We don't think rebel groups in most circumstances are the option. First, high-level targets. The first thing I want to point out is sometimes you have terrorist leaders with a great deal of power, in contrast to what we hear from opening opposition. Why is that true? One, because terrorist movements have as their currency violence, and you often have power struggles within those movements themselves. That means that individual leaders are often fearful of their own deaths, and they're fearful that they could be expendable and as a result will be removed. I'll give you an example of this. General Dostrom, who became the leader of the Uzbek Afghan militants, only got to that position because he killed other leaders within that movement. So what do leaders in terrorist organizations do? They try and make themselves indispensable. This means they have more resources than others. This is probably more important that they have more knowledge and understanding how to conduct operations than other individuals. They have individual networks, and perhaps most importantly that they structure terrorist groups around familial networks. Remove those individuals, you take away lots of those incentives and lots of the advantages. Exactly what happened in the case of the TTP. Secondly, note that when between terrorist groups, they're often very fluid. Look, for instance, at ISIL, losing and gaining support of Al-Qaeda constantly over the last few years. Given that, they're often only put together because of friendship networks, because of individuals within the top leadership who end up liking each other. It might sound really, really banal, but it's often true that terrorist movements are only associated with each other because of personal reasons, and once you remove those individuals, you fracture those movements in the first place. Opening opposition say that drone attacks also target low-level leaders. I'm willing to accept that, but I don't think that's a problem. When you kill leaders, for instance, of Al-Qaeda networks in the Helmand province or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, we still think that means that you have so many of the benefits which we were talking about in terms of the removal. So that side of the House then ultimately somewhat accepts that, and they have to suggest alternatives. The first alternative they want to give us is ground troops. As we point out, you by and large can't have ground troops in the vast majority of countries which they want to talk about. Opening government point out that the United States population and other Western populations are unwilling to do so. Note why. Closing government explained perfectly why. You have terrain which it's very difficult to cross. You by and large don't have roads to get from one place to another place very, very rapidly. You always fear about losing popular support. So why exactly are drones beneficial? Firstly, because they can get there much, much faster. The 2003 case where surveillance drones found Osama bin Laden, but we couldn't scramble fighters in time, is a great illustration of that point. Secondly, they can be in the air for a great deal longer. This might sound trivial, but they can move faster because they're much lighter, and therefore the same amount of fuel, they can stay in the area. They can stay in the area for a much faster period of time. So what are the alternatives they give you? Firstly, ground troops. Couple points on that. Apart from the fact we're unable to use them, it's also worth noting they often cause the worst numbers of civilian casualties. Why? Because when you are face to face with people who could be a threat to you, fear kicks in. You are far more likely to be trigger happy when your own life is on the line, rather than when you're in Colorado and you're manning a drone. They secondly say that we should use airstrikes instead. First thing I want to point out about it is when you use airstrikes, you often cause exactly the same problems that side of the House talks about. Why? Because the United States and Western states are so unwilling to lose their own military individuals, they fight from a great deal of height. This is a great example of NATO when it came to Kosovo. When you had firing from 40,000 feet, at that level you couldn't have precision bombing. At that level you could end up with far more civilian casualties because you couldn't easily target. Drones can fly much, much lower without risking civilian casualties for the simple reason there is no military personnel and you don't have the military leaders having that incentive to get in place. But the final point on this is often when you do have ground troops, or even when you have low-flying helicopters, which is often the actual alternative, you lose political support in places like the United States. Syria gives you the example of Somalia, when you ended up with a few civilian casualties, removing the entire US troop presence from that. That may not happen in circumstances where something is seen to be a vital security interest. But for instance, in Yemen, it's something which is highly unlikely the United States could do and absorb civilian casualties in the first place, or even the case in Iraq. After 2007 and 2008, it was no longer seen as vital for the United States and the population to stay in. You see some level of disengagement, and that simply wasn't good enough because you did end up with the situation kick-starting again. Let's finally talk about collateral damage first.
Okay, but different with extrajudicial killing in primary news is that you do not have closure. Population does not have closure whether that was a villain or was a hero.
Right, okay.
Therefore,
Okay, so you don't have closure, but you do have fewer people dying, which probably reduces the need for future closure. I'm okay with that. Let's talk about collateral damage. In the first place, we think there are good reasons why you have the reduction in collateral damage and more careful accountability from the command structure of the US military itself. Closing opposite government explains this beautifully when they tell you about the cycle of violence which is created. Newsflash, the US government realizes that. That's why after betrays in 2007, 2008, you've been much, much careful in terms of who you target, knowing that if you kill excess civilian casualties, you end up with problems. Secondly, because of civil litigation. After the Faros City massacres in 2006, you had people being sued in the United States for unnecessary civilian casualties and huge settlements under alien tort. This also internalizes many of the collateral damage implications. And sure, you'll end up with some debts, but we think that is something which in the end is worth paying. The final thing, as our previous speaker says, is terrorist movements are ultimately only created by civilian casualties. I don't think this is true. I think there are multiple reasons you have terrorist groups, and it's worth noting the case of ISIS. We hear lots of alternative reasons why they're created, and it's worth noting the Sunni uprising where Sunni individuals worked with the US government was after drone attacks because they ultimately had an interest in removing Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Ultimately, other interests are often preponderant. In the end, we're willing to accept civilian casualties because there isn't an option and we don't think they're that bad anymore. We're pretty happy to propose.
Thank you, Government Whip. And now we invite the opposition group to close this debate.
Okay. In this debate, I'm going to show you how do we keep civilians safe, and in this debate, I'm going to show you in my speech, I'm going to show you how are we actually going to, with drones, eliminate civilians and having hidden agendas from the United States, having a lot of not good results coming out of drone strikes. What I'm going to do it in 4 points that I'm going to discuss. Firstly, I'm going to discuss, do we actually know where the targets are? Second point is about ground troops and aircraft. Are they really good and effective ways? And are the drones really those who are the most effective ways? Thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about how the war actually starts, what is essential for the war actually to start and for terrorists to begin their campaign and to begin their activities. And fourthly, I'm going to talk about are the drones more careful right now than they were before. So starting firstly, I'm going to rebuttal a few things that the closing government said. In a first point, which is we know right now where the targets are. Okay, of course, the US intelligence, who have the best maybe perhaps the best intelligence in the world, sometimes will find their targets. But in the vast majority of cases, they're not doing so. If they, a logical assumption is, if they do, they would have maybe sent, troops to dead areas everywhere where there are the heads of the terrorist groups, and they would eliminate them. Why are they not doing that? Because they don't know where they're hiding. They're in mountain areas, they're in all different areas, and they do not know actually where they are. Sometimes they will find them, no thank you, but in vast majority of cases, they're lacking in their intelligence to actually find them, and that brings consequences that we are fighting a war that isn't actually what we know. They're saying us, okay, but sometimes we might fail, sometimes we might. We are not okay by missing targets. We are not okay if we allegedly put a drone and kill 3,000 people. We are not okay if we didn't actually fulfill any purpose that we set ourselves on. That is 3,000 civilians are dead because of our mistake. We do not approve of that. We think that is bad because civilians are then hurting because somebody thought the target was there and it isn't, and that means we are actually doing a war which we are fighting a war which we do not know how to fight, and we do not know where to start looking for the answers, where to start looking for the leaders. about that fragmentation that is happening, that is actually because of these drones, it is actually worse. It is worse in the case because now we have more leaders who are working on a wider area, and it means it's harder for us to eliminate a lot more leaders, terrorist leaders, than we had before. No, thank you. Second thing I'm going to discuss is about ground troops. They're saying us the drones have put a place, very small place, so we can eliminate those leaders, so we actually know where they are. But actually what we are saying, the opening opposition and the closing opposition is telling to you that ground troops are very useful because they do have that personal contact with what is happening. They do have They do have the contact with the war that is happening, and they can. They can process the situation and act according to that. No, thank you. Then I'm going to say, okay, military isn't maybe always the most effective one, but what they are not showing to us why drones are the most effective ways to combating war, to combating terrorists. They're not showing to us how actually these drones are in vast majority of cases going to execute leaders of terrorist groups. No, thank you, because we don't know where they're hiding, because we don't know where they are. Thirdly, what I'm going to talk to you about is, okay, but before that, go.
But actually the presence of ground troops and the whole country see the ground troops in America as the oppressor is actually the reason why these people join the radical groups and why you actually have these terrorist groups, not the drones themselves being present there.
And if you don't have drones, then you don't have people who are starting to become terrorists. This is actually the worst case scenario because you are fighting somebody that you don't actually know. You can't assume when the attacks are going to happen. That means you're fighting the enemy that you don't know where and when they will strike. That means you're becoming much more extremist in your views. That means you're much more radicalizing everything. That means you're doing things that you could not, that you would not do if you know where the military is. You know how are they operating. No, thank you. But no, thank you. But you do. But when the drones are, you can't process all. You do not know when and where they will strike, which means you're fighting somebody that you don't know of. No, thank you. And that means you have to become more radical in order to get your strategical interest, because that's the only way you will succeed. If you have more radical views, if you have more radical methods. No, thank you. Another thing that they didn't actually discuss was our substantive point that we made. Where is actually the legitimacy of the USA to strike with drones and give civilian casualties in these areas? Where is the legitimacy of the USA? Just because they're economically maybe the best country in the world and have the highest GDP, does that actually mean they have the legitimacy to go in Middle East countries to strike drones and to get their strategical interests, such as oil, such as natural resources? Where is the legitimacy of the United States of America to actually fight this terrorism activities with drones by killing a lot of civilians and actually not doing anything more, because we haven't heard in the vast majority of cases that they have succeeded. Thank you very much.